The hall was lit by immense crystal chandeliers reflecting a golden glow onto the haughty faces of the assembled heirs. The annual event brought together the children of the region's wealthiest families, those born into privilege and power. Classical music played in the background, waiters in white gloves served expensive wines, and the atmosphere was imbued with vanity. However, amidst all the designer attire and artificial smiles, there was a presence that stood out. A black man in a simple suit with a firm gaze and a discreet posture watched silently. No one there knew the weight of his history, nor the extent of the secret he carried. To them, he was merely an intruder. His name was Ethan Cole, though few in that room remembered it. To most, he was still just the scholarship orphan, a boy who had once dared to walk the marble halls of the same school as them, but always as an unwanted shadow. Now, years later, Ethan returned not as a student but as a guest, but no one understood the reason for his presence at this event reserved for elite businessmen. His silence aroused suspicion and his steady eyes were unsettling. He didn't carry the ostentatious shine of jewelry or expensive watches, but something deeper, a quiet, almost enigmatic confidence. The atmosphere of contempt began subtly, as it always had in the past. Some whispered, pointing at him from the corners of their mouths, chuckling. Others stared with long, malicious gazes as if reliving memories of past humiliations. With each passing minute, Ethan seemed to be swallowed up by the hostile atmosphere, but his expression remained unchanged, impenetrable. No one knew it, but he had learned to mask the pain, to keep the ghosts of his childhood to himself. The hall, so full of luxury, seemed to transform once again into the schoolyard where he had been isolated so many times. The past was alive before him. Suddenly, a loud laugh broke the elegant atmosphere of the event. It was Richard Bennett, grandson of an oil tycoon, who recognized him first. He raised his champagne glass and in a voice dripping with sarcasm said, "Look who decided to show up. The boy from the orphanage is back." The comment echoed like a gunshot through the room, drawing immediate laughter from the other heirs. Ethan remained motionless, his expression unchanged, but his eyes flashed for a second as if an old memory had been forcibly ripped away. To Richard, it was just cruel amusement, but to Ethan it was confirmation that nothing had changed. The jokes multiplied in seconds. "Did he come to ask for a job?" One of them scoffed. "Or maybe he's here to serve drinks, as he always should be," another added. Laughter rent the air and the room filled with a heavy, mocking energy. The guests laughed without thinking of the consequences, without imagining that this man carried something that would change the fate of all of them. To them, Ethan was nothing more than an uncomfortable remnant of a past they liked to relive to feel superior. The collective laughter made them believe that all the power was still in their hands. Ethan remained calm, but inside, every word was like a sharp blade. He remembered the nights at the orphanage alone, while the others returned to luxurious mansions. He remembered the old caretaker who had become his only father figure, teaching him resilience and dignity. He remembered above all the day this man with his secret fortune decided to adopt him and take him away from that toxic environment. Every joke he made now brought echoes of a past he had overcome, but which had left deep scars. Yet Ethan wouldn't back down. He knew the moment of truth was about to arrive. Across the room, a huge screen projected corporate logos. All of these companies belonged to the families present, but they were in crisis, frozen in time. The event had an urgent objective: to sign a partnership with an international technology company, the only one capable of saving their empires from imminent bankruptcy. But none of them yet knew who the man behind this tech giant was. They believed they would be negotiating with someone from another reality, someone far from their small social bubble. The shock was still being saved for the right moment. One of the heirs, Oliver Hayes, the son of a steel industrialist, approached with disdain. His smile carried the same arrogance from his school days. "Do you really think you belong here?" he asked, looking Ethan up and down. The black man's silence seemed to be interpreted as weakness, as submission. Oliver then added, "You should be grateful to be breathing the same air as us, because opportunities like this aren't meant for people like you." The words cut through the air, and once again laughter filled the room. Ethan took a deep breath but didn't respond. His silence was even more disturbing than any words. What the others didn't understand was that he didn't need to justify himself. He didn't need to prove anything to these people. His place there wasn't the result of charity, nor was it an accident. He was there by merit, by work, by genius. But revealing that now would be hastening the climax. So he remained silent, holding Oliver's haughty gaze until the silence became an unbearable weight for everyone. It was as if time itself were holding its breath. From the stage, a master of ceremonies announced that the official introduction of the CEO of the partner technology company would soon be made. The room vibrated with anticipation. Everyone wanted to see who would be the man capable of saving their decaying empires. Ethan, still motionless, knew the moment was coming, but no one suspected a thing. To them, he remained the poor boy, the orphanage scholarship student, someone who would never free himself from the scars of his past. The suspense was becoming unbearable, and the tension in the air grew with each passing second. The game was just beginning. As the guests waited, some security guards were discreetly instructed to keep an eye on Ethan. "We don't want any trouble with intruders," the organizers said. The irony was cruel. They were about to expel from the event the very man who would determine everyone's fate. Ethan observed every detail attentively, as if revisiting a chessboard he already knew by heart. The hall, for all its pomp, was nothing more than a stage, and the actors, unbeknownst to them, were following a script written long ago, of which he was the hidden protagonist. At the back of the room, Ethan closed his eyes for a moment. He remembered the orphanage, the smell of old wood, the calloused hands of the caretaker who had once believed in him. He remembered the early morning studying alone, the trip to Europe, the first lines of code that would change his life. His entire past flashed before his eyes like a movie. When he opened them again, there was only certainty in his gaze. He knew the night would end differently, and when the truth came out, no one would ever forget his name, Ethan Cole. The room seemed increasingly smaller to Ethan, not because of the physical space, but because of the psychological siege forming around him. The heirs, intoxicated by alcohol and their own ego, approached in small groups like predators circling their prey. The collective laughter grew louder, more cruel, and each word was an invisible blade piercing his dignity. They saw him as an unimportant intruder, an uncomfortable reminder of the time they had to share a space with someone they considered inferior. Ethan, however, remained firm, offering no reaction that could further fuel the spectacle. Richard Bennett was the first to turn the jokes into something more direct. He approached with the arrogance of someone who had never heard a no in his life and said, "You must still have small dreams, don't you? Maybe opening a little shop on the corner or chauffeuring someone important." Laughter erupted around him, but Ethan just stared at him, unblinking. The silence, instead of lessening it, caused a strange discomfort in the attackers. They wanted to see him explode, defend himself, react desperately, but they couldn't elicit anything beyond an enigmatic calm. This control irritated them even more. Oliver Hayes, always thirsty for attention, decided to add to the humiliation. He called a waiter and, pointing at Ethan, ordered him to hand him the tray of glasses. "Go ahead. You look more comfortable serving than drinking." The room erupted in laughter as the waiter, embarrassed, hesitated to hand over the tray. Ethan looked at the young waiter, who looked more uncomfortable than he, and shook his head with a slight smile. "Don't worry, you don't need this," he said calmly, breaking the mocking mood for a moment. This unexpected gesture only increased the heirs' hatred. The cruelty grew in waves, growing heavier and heavier. Someone suggested removing Ethan immediately, but another countered, "Let him stay. It's fun to remember how much he'll never be like us." The words echoed like daggers thrown through the air. For the guests, this game was simply a way to reaffirm their power and social standing. For Ethan, it was a painful replay of old memories, a play he'd seen countless times before. Only this time, the outcome would be different. He was no longer the helpless child they had to ridicule. One of the older businessmen, Oliver's father, watched the scene from afar, without intervening. It was as if he approved of the humiliation, seeing it as a natural part of the social order he had always upheld. Ethan noticed the man's gaze and felt the weight of the legacy of prejudice that had crossed generations. The children were simply repeating what they had learned from their parents, that he, being black and an orphan, should always occupy the place of subordinate. It was a wound that would not heal, but it was also the flame that had driven him to prove his worth in the world. As the provocations intensified, a master of ceremonies announced that the official meeting would begin soon. The heirs were still laughing, but some of the audience had already diverted their attention to the business at hand. The companies present were in crisis, losing relevance amid the technological transformations of the modern world. Hope for salvation lay in a single strategic alliance, and everyone eagerly awaited the arrival of the CEO of Nexus Systems, whose identity remained a secret. Ironically, the butt of all the jokes was precisely the man everyone was waiting for. Richard, trying to get another laugh, said aloud, "Just imagine if that were the CEO. What a joke. Our companies would be lost forever." People laughed again, some with a certain discomfort, as if sensing the comment was too dangerous. Ethan didn't react, just lifted his chin slightly as if accepting the challenge hidden in the words. Deep inside, he felt the irony of the situation. They were mocking the very man capable of saving them from ruin. Fate seemed to savor this moment. Oliver wasn't content with just mocking. He wanted to physically humiliate. Dramatically, he deliberately spilled a few drops of wine near Ethan's shoes and said, "Oops, careful not to slip. This floor isn't made for feet like yours." More laughter erupted. Ethan looked down, took a deep breath, and calmly wiped his shoe with a handkerchief. When he looked up again, his expression was serene, but there was a flame in his eyes as if he had just sealed a silent decision. He would never forget every word spoken that night. Meanwhile, some of the more attentive executives whispered among themselves, suspicious of Ethan's mysterious presence. "Who is this man?" one of them asked. "He doesn't seem like just any guest." But the heirs smothered any doubts with laughter and teasing, ensuring he was seen as nothing more than an insignificant figure. This contrast created an invisible tension. Those laughing didn't realize that Ethan's silence was more powerful than any answer. It was the silence of someone who knew something that everyone else completely ignored. The atmosphere began to divide. On one side, the heirs continued to make fun of Ethan, repeating the old dynamics of power and prejudice. On the other, some business people and even neutral guests began to watch the situation with discomfort, realizing that the scene was too embarrassing for such a momentous event. The embarrassment grew, but no one had the courage to interrupt the humiliation. It was as if everyone were trapped in a cruel spectacle, waiting to see how far it would go before it exploded. When the master of ceremonies finally announced that Nexus's regional representative was arriving to introduce the CEO, the entire room turned toward the main entrance. The mood suddenly shifted as if a bolt of anticipation cut through the air heavy with humiliation. Everyone wanted to see who the powerful man was who could save their fortunes. Ethan, still in the same spot, took a deep breath and discreetly clenched his fists. The tide was about to turn. The conflict had escalated to a point where no one could turn back. The announcement of the regional representative's arrival didn't stop the taunts against Ethan. On the contrary, it gave the heirs even more confidence to mock him. "You won't even be invited to the presentation," Richard said, gently shoving him with his shoulder. The laughter returned, but now it sounded more nervous, as if hiding an unspoken insecurity. Ethan took a deep breath, trying to suppress the storm raging within him. With every word, every scornful look, he felt like he was back in the schoolyard, alone against the world, surrounded by laughter that echoed like open scars. The hall was packed, but Ethan felt more alone than ever. Everyone seemed to conspire against his presence, as if he were an intruder on forbidden territory. The past came rushing back, the freezing school hallways, the looks of contempt when he sat in the cafeteria, the awkward silence when he raised his hand in class and no one wanted to partner him. Those memories had never disappeared. They had simply been dormant. Now, faced with the same faces, they resurfaced with the intensity of a wound that had never truly healed. He thought of the orphanage, of the long nights staring at the cracked ceiling of the shared room. He remembered the emptiness of having no family, no one to share his triumphs with or tears with. Only one man had reached out to him in those days, the old caretaker, Mr. Walter Green, who saw something in that boy no one else understood. Ethan remembered the stories the old man told, the advice to never let the hatred of others define him. But even with those words of wisdom, the pain of being treated as inferior never left him. While the others drank and laughed, Ethan retreated into his own thoughts. The sound of clinking glasses, background music, and raised voices blended together, forming a chaotic symphony of exclusion. He felt that each laugh carried years of accumulated prejudice, a poisonous inheritance passed down from generation to generation. Even after all he had achieved, even after building his own empire, in that moment he was reduced once again to the orphanage boy. The weight of invisibility crushed him, and yet he remained erect as if silently waging an internal battle. Flashes of his youth in Europe came back to him clearly. He remembered the first time he entered a foreign university, afraid of rejection but determined to prove his worth. He remembered the sleepless nights studying and programming while his wealthier peers slept peacefully. Each line of code was an attempt to free himself from the shadow of the past, each completed project a cry of affirmation. Now, ironically, he was facing the same people who had once made him doubt himself, but who, unbeknownst to them, depended entirely on his work. The feeling of isolation was suffocating. He was surrounded by hundreds of people, but none of them truly saw him. To the heirs, he was invisible, an irrelevant detail in the luxurious landscape that surrounded them. To the older businessmen, he was merely a mysterious presence that caused discomfort. No one knew who he really was, and this left him trapped in a kind of social limbo. Ethan felt as if he had built a castle with his own hands, but he was still seen as a beggar outside the gates. Prejudice was a wall that seemed insurmountable. Yet there was a quiet strength within him. Behind the suffering, there was pride in the journey he had taken. He remembered when he founded Nexus Systems in a small apartment in Europe, with no resources, only determination and talent. His first clients distrusted a young black man, but his genius proved otherwise with each delivery. Little by little, his company grew until it became indispensable to international giants. Now, those very people who had ridiculed him were about to kneel before his creation. This memory was the only thing that kept him from giving in to the weight of their contempt. With each joke, Ethan wondered how many others were going through the same thing as him in silence. How many young people in schools and businesses were diminished simply because of their skin color or humble background. The suffering wasn't just his. It was part of a collective wound that spanned generations. He felt that in some way his presence there represented all those who had never had a voice. And though it was painful to endure the humiliation, he knew the moment of truth was coming, and when it arrived, it would not only be a personal victory, but a blow to all the arrogance surrounding him. At one point, Ethan discreetly stepped away from the crowd, walking to a quieter corner of the room. There he watched the groups forming, the animated conversations and the laughter that continued to echo. From his perspective, it was like watching a grotesque theater, where each character believed they were the absolute protagonist. He, however, knew the play was about to change its script. The isolation he now felt would be replaced by something greater, something no one could ignore. His suffering was not in vain. It was the harbinger of a revelation. A young intern working for one of the businessmen passed by and, recognizing him, smiled discreetly. It was a shy smile but full of respect, unlike anything he had received that night. Ethan returned it with an almost imperceptible nod, as if in that moment there existed an invisible connection between two worlds, those who humiliate and those who resist. This small gesture gave him strength. He wasn't completely alone, even if the entire room seemed to conspire against him. There would always be someone capable of seeing beyond appearances. Isolation still weighed heavily on him, but Ethan knew how to wait. He was no longer the boy yearning for acceptance. Now he was in control of time and destiny. The suffering he carried was fuel, not weakness. What the heirs saw as fragility was, in fact, a discipline forged in the fire of rejection. He knew that in a few minutes the tables would be turned, and when the truth came out, the silence that now suffocated him would turn into the shocked silence of those who had scorned him. The mood in the room seemed poised to change with the arrival of the regional representative, but the heirs didn't want to miss the chance to make a spectacle of the evening at Ethan's expense. Richard, visibly drunk, had the cruel idea of asking security to remove him. "This guy doesn't belong here. He's ruining the image of our meeting," he said loudly, drawing knowing glances. Oliver reinforced, "It's a disgrace to have someone like him hanging around us. This is a business meeting, not a charity shelter." The venom-laced words echoed throughout the room. The security guards, not quite understanding the situation, approached Ethan firmly. One of them placed a hand on his shoulder and said coldly, "Sir, we're going to need you to escort him out." The entire room turned its gaze to the scene, and what could have been a discreet measure turned into a public humiliation. The heirs smiled with satisfaction, as if they had finally won the game. Ethan remained calm, but within him the weight of injustice burned like fire. It wasn't enough to mock him with words. Now they wanted to physically erase him from that place. As he was led toward the door, Richard didn't miss the chance to unleash more venom. "Look, gentlemen, this is the fate of those who believe they can be like us. They always end up being put in their place." The laughter erupted once more, loud and cruel, filling the hall like a macabre celebration. Some more sensible guests looked away, ashamed to be part of the spectacle, but none had the courage to intervene. The weight of collective cowardice was as great as the cruelty of the heirs. Ethan walked in silence, feeling each gaze like a blade against his skin. Oliver, going even further, grabbed the microphone from the MC and turned the scene into a spectacle. "Before we get down to business, I want to thank our friend here for reminding us where we came from and where we don't want to be. Give it up for the boy from the orphanage who tried to play at greatness." The room erupted in mock applause and deafening laughter. Ethan, being pushed by security, kept his head high, but his heart beat like a war drum. Each false applause was a reminder that prejudice knows no bounds. The master of ceremonies tried to regain control, but Oliver wouldn't let him. "Get this man out of here. We don't have time to waste on imposters," he said, smiling proudly. Ethan took a deep breath, feeling his dignity being tested to the limit. The weight of years of humiliation weighed on his shoulders as if the entire past had returned in a single instant. But he wouldn't budge. There was something in his silence that intrigued even the security guards, who hesitated to treat him violently. His calm seemed greater than all the arrogance surrounding him. One of the older businessmen approached and tried to intervene, but was quickly silenced by Oliver. "We don't need pity here. We need respect for tradition, and tradition means keeping everyone in their place." The comment drew applause from the heirs, who were feeding on their own hateful words. Ethan watched in silence, but within him grew an absolute certainty. In a few moments, all those who humiliated him would be forced to reconsider their words. The extreme injustice would not be forgotten. It would become the root of the coming clash. Meanwhile, security guards were already leading him to the main door. With every step, the guests whispered, laughed, and took pictures with their cell phones, transforming their pain into a spectacle. Ethan felt the same cold he had felt years ago, when he was expelled from class after an unfair accusation made by classmates who hated him. The pattern repeated itself, the black orphan always being cast out, always treated like a foreign body. But this time there was a fundamental difference. Now he was no longer helpless. Now he held the power to change history. Just as Ethan reached the door, the regional representative finally entered the room. His serious expression contrasted with the mocking atmosphere that still pervaded the room. He quickly took the stage, firmly motioning for silence. The audience was slow to quiet down, but the authority in his voice was enough to hold everyone's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "Nexus Systems thanks you for your welcome and trust at this crucial moment for the future of your companies." A respectful silence fell, but Ethan was still on the verge of being expelled. Richard, seeing an opportunity to end the humiliation with a flourish, pointed at Ethan and shouted, "Before we continue, get this man out of here. He doesn't belong here." The regional representative, confused, looked at the scene, watching the group of security guards holding Ethan by the armband. Uncomfortable feelings spread throughout the room, but no one dared to question Richard openly. The tension was palpable. The stage was set for the revelation that would change everything, but the heirs still believed they were in complete control of the situation. The representative raised his hand, signaling the security guards to stop. "One moment," he said firmly. The security guards, surprised, stopped their action and looked in his direction. The room fell silent, as if everyone knew something was about to happen. Richard and Oliver exchanged impatient glances, unable to understand the pause. Ethan, still held by the arms, lifted his face and fixed his eyes on the stage. Behind that silent gaze there was the promise of a devastating turn of events. The extreme injustice was complete, and now all that remained was to wait for the shock. The representative took a deep breath, surveyed the entire room, and then turned directly to Ethan. His voice echoed clearly through the microphone. "First of all, I have the honor of introducing to you all the man without whom this meeting would not exist. The CEO of Nexus Systems." The silence was absolute, as if the air had been knocked out of the room. All laughter died instantly. The looks of contempt turned to disbelief, and the stunned security guards released Ethan's arms as they realized the enormity of their mistake. The tide was about to turn irreversibly. The hall fell into absolute, heavy, almost suffocating silence. The regional representative's words echoed like thunder, paralyzing everyone. The same man who seconds before had been treated like trash was now presented as the savior of empires. Richard let out a nervous laugh, believing this could only be a mistake. Oliver, red with rage and disbelief, stammered incoherently, unable to accept what he had heard. Ethan, freed from the security guard's grasp, calmly straightened his jacket and took a few steps toward the stage. His every movement carried a crushing symbolic weight. When he took the stage, eyes followed him with a mixture of shame, fear, and disbelief. The laughter that had once filled the room had now vanished, replaced by an awkward silence. Ethan took the microphone, looked out at the audience, and took a deep breath. For a few seconds, he said nothing. He simply stared at them with a calmness that contrasted with the emotional turmoil the others were facing. This wasn't just a triumphant entrance. It was the rebirth of the boy who had once been crushed, now transformed into the man who held everyone's fate in his hands. Richard tried to regain control of the situation, shouting, "This is a mistake. He can't be the CEO." But his voice sounded weak, lacking the same arrogance as before. The regional representative responded firmly, "There's no mistake. This is the man who built Nexus Systems, the company that now sustains global operations. Without him, the companies you represent will not survive." The words were like knives, leaving the heirs speechless. The entire room seemed to revolve around Ethan, as if he were the only fixed point in a sea of disbelief and shock. Ethan held the microphone, but he was in no rush to speak. He wanted everyone to feel the weight of silence, for every second to be a slow torture for those who ridiculed him. Finally, his voice echoed deep and calm. "For years you told me I was nothing. Today, nothing is the only thing that can save you." The impact was immediate. Some people lowered their heads, others averted their eyes, unable to face the truth. It was as if Ethan's every word was a mirror, reflecting the poison they themselves had created. Oliver, still in disbelief, tried to confront him directly. "You're lying. You must be just a puppet used by the company." Ethan smiled then, for the first time that night, a cold, calculated smile. "Want proof?" he asked. He pulled a small device from his pocket, and with a click made the giant screen in the background project the Nexus logo accompanied by his digital signature. "I'm not a puppet. I'm the architect of everything that sustains the business you inherited without any merit." The audience erupted in shocked murmurs, and Oliver fell silent, defeated by the weight of the truth. At that moment, the master of ceremonies took the microphone again to formalize the partnership. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight marks the beginning of a new era. Thanks to the visionary work of Mr. Ethan Cole, businesses in this region will be able to meet the challenges of modernity." But no one celebrated. The shock was so great that the announcement sounded distant, irrelevant. All eyes remained fixed on Ethan, as if they still couldn't comprehend the brutal role reversal. The same man who had been expelled minutes earlier was now the central figure in their survival. The atmosphere of embarrassment spread like a wave. Previously arrogant heirs now shrank in their chairs, unable to maintain their pride. Some more experienced executives, ashamed, avoided looking directly at Ethan, aware that they had allowed the humiliation to unfold before their very eyes. Social power, which had always been in their hands, had changed hands in a matter of minutes. That collective silence was the confession of guilt of an entire elite, and Ethan, standing in the center, was the silent judge of this makeshift court. Ethan continued, his voice as firm as steel. "I could have let you all go bankrupt. I could have watched your inheritances dissolve into the dust of time, but I decided to offer you a second chance, not for your sake, but for the workers who depend on your companies for their livelihoods." The room grew even heavier. He didn't speak with anger. He spoke with conviction. And this was all the more devastating, for it revealed greatness the others never possessed. The contrast between the heir's arrogance and Ethan's dignity became unbearable. At this point, some guests began to applaud timidly, not for the revelation, but for his courage in facing all the stares head-on. The applause grew slowly, like a wave expanding uncontrollably. The heirs, embarrassed, remained silent, unable to react. Ethan, however, wasn't seeking applause. He knew this wasn't the end of the story, but merely the climax of a struggle that had been raging since childhood. The pain didn't disappear with the revelation. It merely reached its peak, about to become a turning point. The atmosphere was electric. It was as if every person in the room was about to explode with emotion, yet at the same time paralyzed by the weight of the scene. Ethan took a deep breath, pocketed the device, and stared at the audience in silence. "Now you know who I am," he finally said. The echo of his words seemed to linger throughout the space. The climax had been reached, and what came next would change not only the lives of those present, but the history of that entire city. The silence after Ethan's words was almost palpable, as if the air had become too heavy to breathe. The once proud heirs now stared at the ground, avoiding his eyes like children caught committing an unforgivable crime. But Ethan didn't stop there. He knew the real turning point wasn't just revealing his position of power, but showing that he knew each of them deeply, their fears, their flaws, and the weaknesses hidden beneath the veil of privilege. The time had come to turn the tables definitively. He walked slowly across the stage, looking directly at Richard. "You called me an orphan as if it were a curse, but I learned to survive without anything. While you, even surrounded by everything, cannot maintain your own inheritance without asking for help. Tell me, Richard, who is the truly weak one here?" The words fell like hammer blows. Richard tried to open his mouth, but no sound came out. The entire hall watched the scene like a silent tribunal. Ethan had just turned the humiliation against his attacker, exposing his dependence and fragility. Then he turned his gaze to Oliver, who was already shaking with anger and shame. "You spilled wine on my shoes to remind me of my place, Yaron. But do you know what your place is today? To beg for my technology to keep your factories running. Without Nexus, thousands of workers will be laid to rest and the empire your father built will crumble to dust." Oliver tried to interrupt, but the regional representative nodded seriously. The humiliation had now changed direction. The one who had previously laughed was now swallowing hard under everyone's gaze. Ethan then turned to Henry Clark, another of his opponents. "You sent me away saying this wasn't the place for me. But know that this place only exists today because I allow it. Every single one of these companies depends on what I built. If I shut down a single system, your fortune will evaporate in minutes." The impact was devastating. Henry tried to justify himself, but was drowned out by the collective silence that weighed down the room. The truth was cruel. Everyone was trapped in the web they had despised moments before. The older businessmen, previously silent, began to realize the gravity of the situation. Some of their faces turned red, not just from shame, but from genuine fear of the power Ethan represented. The arrogance inherited from generations seemed to crumble before the genius of a man they had tried to erase since childhood. It was as if time had taken its toll, bringing back each act of injustice as punishment. The turnaround was not just business-related. It was historical, moral, and personal. Then Ethan paused for a long moment, taking a deep breath before revealing the most unexpected revelation of the evening. "Many of you may not know, but I was never alone. The man who raised me, who gave me the chance to study, was someone you knew very well. Mr. Walter Green, the janitor you ignored, was actually a millionaire who chose to live a humble life. He was the one who believed in me when none of you did." Shock coursed through the room like a bolt of lightning. Suddenly, all their memories of the old janitor came flooding back, now tainted by the revelation. The heirs looked at each other in disbelief, remembering the times they had mocked old Green, treating him as invisible. Now they discovered that this silent man not only had a fortune, but had also left his legacy in Ethan. It was a double whammy. Not only had the orphan become CEO, but the figure they had despised had been the foundation of it all. The weight of the revelation crushed each heir like an impossible burden. The shame could no longer be hidden. Ethan continued, his voice firm but now more emotional. "He taught me that true wealth is not in what we inherit, but in what we build. You received everything ready-made, and yet you don't know how to take care of what you have. I, who had nothing, built something the whole world needs." The audience, previously divided, began to applaud louder. It wasn't just applause for the revelation, but for recognizing the justice that was finally being established before their eyes. At that moment, the expressions of some of the heirs changed from mockery to despair. They finally understood that their survival depended on the man they had trampled on their entire lives. Some tried to hide it, others sweated in silence, but all now bore the mark of shame. Ethan, on the other hand, stood erect, proud, not like an avenger driven by hatred, but like someone carrying unshakable dignity. The scene had become a public lesson impossible to erase. The audience, also comprised of journalists and investors, was already whispering about what this would mean for the future. Headlines were being written in real time. The humiliated orphan is the CEO who will save the city. Camera flashes began to illuminate Ethan's face, which remained serene. The turnaround was complete. Those who had laughed now cringed. Those who had mocked now pleaded. And those who had driven him out now had to beg him to stay. Past and present met in a single instant of justice. Ethan remained silent for a few seconds after this final revelation, letting everyone digest the weight of what they had heard. The hall still vibrated with murmurs and camera flashes, but the overriding feeling was shame. The same heirs who had so often placed themselves above everyone else now bowed, if only in their eyes, before the man who surpassed them in every way. Life had come full circle, and the orphan who had been cast out of their midst now stood as the anchor of their fortune's survival. He took a deep breath and said, "I didn't come here for revenge. I didn't come to return pain with pain. I came to show that dignity can't be bought with inheritance, and that respect can't be earned with arrogance. I came to remind everyone that no one is too small to be great, and that prejudice isn't just unfair, it's also a blindness that destroys the future." The silence in the hall became absolute. Each word was like a scalpel, cutting deep not only into the attackers but into everyone present who witnessed the historic scene. Richard, who had been haughty until then, stood hesitantly. His eyes were watery and his voice was cracking. "Ethan, I didn't know." But the words sounded empty, weightless, like apologies thrown to the wind. Ethan didn't respond. He just stared at him firmly, making it clear that forgiveness isn't achieved with loose phrases but with real change. Oliver, for his part, couldn't even stand. His body trembled and he simply hid his face in his hands, crushed by the weight of public shame. The regional representative took the microphone and declared, "Tonight is not just about business. It's about recognizing that true value lies not in surnames but in what is built with courage and intelligence. Today, Mr. Ethan Cole proved that character and vision are stronger than any inheritance." The audience erupted in heartfelt applause, no longer timid but intense, like a collective catharsis. This was Ethan's definitive consecration, not just as a technological genius, but as a symbol of resilience and justice. Ethan raised his hand for silence and continued, "I don't expect everyone to change overnight, but I hope this night will be etched in your memories, not as the night you were humiliated, but as the night you understood that the world has changed, and that if you don't change with it, you'll be just forgotten pieces of history." His words resonated like prophecy. It was impossible not to feel the weight of the message. The old orphan was now the master and the heirs the apprentices. Slowly, some business people began approaching Ethan, offering handshakes and words of recognition. But he received them calmly, without becoming agitated, knowing that this gesture didn't erase the past. The workers, journalists, and investors watching everything understood that the lesson of that night was bigger than contracts and partnerships. It was about how prejudice blinds and how resilience can transform the destiny of someone everyone considered insignificant. Power had changed hands, but above all, respect had been earned. The security guards who had previously pushed him out now escorted him reverently, clearing a path for him to pass like a king, returning triumphantly to his throne. The contrast was stark and symbolic. Where there had been humiliation, there was now reverence. Where there had been laughter, there was now heartfelt applause. The scene wasn't just a personal victory, it represented that in the face of truth, no mask of privilege can hold. Ethan walked serenely, aware that he was writing history. As he left the stage, he remembered the cold nights at the orphanage, the smell of the polished floors Old Man Green had cleaned, the simple but wise words that had shaped him. You don't have to be accepted to be great. You just have to believe in what you can build. Those words now echoed in his mind like a victory song. Green was no longer alive to witness it, but Ethan knew that somewhere the old caretaker smiled with pride. The event ended with headlines already being broadcast around the world. Orphan humiliated as a child returns as CEO and saves declining heirs. It was the perfect story, worthy of being told for generations. But for Ethan, it wasn't about fame. It was about justice, about showing that dignity has no color, that talent isn't born with a silver spoon in its mouth, and that prejudice always backfires on those who practice it. The true legacy of that night wasn't just business. It was human, moral, and eternal. As he left, looking back at the city that once rejected him, Ethan smiled softly. not because he had vanquished his enemies, but because he had proven that no one can determine the destiny of another human being. The lesson had been taught. The rejected orphan had become the man who held in his hands not only the future of companies, but also the hope that prejudice could be challenged and defeated. The night was not just one of victory, it was one of redemption.